if there is a date of enough is enough, that you would see the pressure strategy on Russia, and that would either be sanctions, more sanctions, something to do with the oil price. Now, the oil price today, certainly a barrel of Brent crude, is $67.7. Somewhere around less than 60 would probably be a nail in the coffin of the Russian economy. But originally, Trump had talked about the sort of getting together with OPEC, less Russia, of course, and driving the price down to $45 a barrel to crucify that. And the third one would be whether further weapon supplies, particularly long-range weapons, are given to Ukraine, with, of course, the intelligence feeds and satellite feeds that they would need to go long distances.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Chapman, a former British military advisor to US Central Command and author of the book Notes from a Small Military. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Louis. Always good to be here.
This morning, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said the US will move on from Ukraine peace talks within days if they don't see some sort of action. Who is this a warning to, though, Ukraine or Russia?
Well, like all these things, it depends what he means by move on. So after he came away from the his trip to NATO on the 4th of April, he did say that we would know in weeks whether Russia was serious about peace. And really, there's 5 sort of decision points that you would look at about what move on means in one way or another. The first one would be that on the 24th of April, so in the next week, we will reach the 30-day end of the 30-day sort of interim ceasefire to do with the infrastructure and Black Sea area. So the first thing would be what would happen after that. The second one, which may precede that, is on the visit of Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, which occurred. He sort of suggested that the 20th of April, that is Sunday, would be the deadline when you would know if Russia were to be serious. And he said that for really 2 reasons, I think. Firstly, it's 3 months in office for Trump. And secondly, the fact that you do need a hard deadline if you think that Russia is serious or not serious about peace. The third one is set a date, because you don't want any more equivocation, because Russia do have this history of having negotiations for negotiation's sake. And that's one of the things that Rubio has said that they don't really want to go towards. The fourth thing or indication as a decision point would be, as a result of that, would the US ramp up either sanctions, more intelligence feed, or weapons feed? So the pressure strategy at the moment is mainly being on Ukraine, and we saw that 2 months ago when they lost their intelligence feed and all those sorts of things. So that's the fourth thing. And the fifth thing, which may be further down the road, is if there is any significant evidence of any Russian offensive operation in either Sumy or Kherson. So all those things would indicate to you what the US position would be, whether move on means that they're moving on from the position of sort of not tacit support for Russia, but this sort of being being fair to both sides as they would see it. But I think one of the things which has been evident in the last few days is that Trump is getting frustrated about this. There's no doubt about that. And he is throwing the blame thrower around. He's blaming both Zelensky, he's blaming Putin, and he's blaming Biden, because, making peace is really, really difficult. And the problem we have at the moment is both of the protagonists, Ukraine and Russia, are looking at this from different ends of the sort of peace spectrum, in a sense. So Ukraine, quite rightly from their perspective, are looking this at from the start point. That is, you start with a ceasefire and then negotiations take place after that. Russia is looking at this from the perspective of the end state. What can we expect to receive at the end? And that's why they keep on going on about root causes, and that they will continue to fight until all their military objectives are are sorted, and those two things don't meet. And to make those two ends meet, you would need patient and probably long-term negotiation. But what you would probably say, and I would hope, of course, is that if there is a date of enough is enough, that you would see the pressure strategy on Russia, and that would either be sanctions, more sanctions, something to do with the oil price. Now, the oil price today, certainly a barrel of Brent crude, is $67.7. Somewhere around less than 60 would probably be a nail in the coffin of the Russian economy. But originally, Trump had talked about the sort of getting together with OPEC, less Russia, of course, and driving the price down to $45 a barrel to crucify that. And the third one would be whether further weapon supplies, particularly long-range weapons, are given to Ukraine, with, of course, the intelligence feeds and satellite feeds that they would need to go long distances. It is worth saying, though, that in the last week there has been long-range strikes by the Ukrainians into really the limits of European Russia. So, for example, last week they attacked the Orenburg 2 airfield, which was 1,000 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. So the ability for the Ukrainians to do deep strikes based on the fact that they do have their own now very significant indigenous weapons production is pretty significant. But of course, there are weapon systems from America which can't be replicated, which is why at the Ramstein meeting last week, the number one priority for Zelensky was, of course, air defense, particularly Patriot. And the sad thing we saw on Palm Sunday was, of course, the consequence of ballistic missiles getting through. If your targeting is not accurate, or whatever policy decision the Russians have taken, is that innocent people die.
And you mentioned there the 30-day ceasefire that Russia tacitly agreed to, didn't agree to, those ongoing airstrikes, and the possibility of further military action on the ground in eastern Ukraine. I mean, is there any sign now that Putin is willing to bring this war to a halt or even slow it?
No, I don't think there's any indication of that whatsoever. And I think there is that sort of realism, certainly amongst European NATO, that is the case. And there were two indications of that last week. Firstly, from Pistorius, the German defense minister at Ramstein, when he talked about peace appearing to be out of reach for the immediate future. And more pragmatically, which he's always been, Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy rep, of course, she was the Prime Minister of Estonia, saying it takes 2 to 1 peace, but it only takes 1 to 1 war. It is Russia, in my view, that still wants the war because they haven't achieved their political objectives. And people forget that wars are fought for political objectives, not for military objectives. Military objectives may be the operational stepping stones to achieving your strategic end state, but that is all that military operations are. They haven't achieved them yet. That is why they keep on going to this end state position, and why they're sort of dancing around Witkoff in terms of, him saying the easiest way to get to a ceasefire is to cede the 4+1 in terms of the Oblast, which they're currently fighting in along with Crimea. But it's worth saying that would not be in any sense a just peace or an equitable peace. Neither would it be a sustainable or durable peace, two of the words which the Americans have often used, for the simple reason that they own 42% of Kherson is still occupied by Ukraine. 40% of Donetsk is still in Ukrainian hands. 30% of Zaporizhia is in Ukrainian hands. So to cede those oblasts would be to give Russia more than they actually have. Of course, in Russian constitutional terms, in September 22, they said that they'd annex those. That is, of course, in international law terms, illegal annexation, which the international community has not signed up to in the slightest.
So it is somewhat recognised that while Russia can tactically advance, it's not maybe of massive strategic advantage. What is their mindset about continuing this war, do you think, Chip?
Well, the CIA director on the 25th of March said that the Russians are grinding forward slowly. and advancing armies rarely stop fighting when opponents become weaker. Certainly, Russia perceives that Ukraine is becoming weaker politically, and it is obviously the case that Putin has a number of times said that the war would stop in a month if Ukraine were not supplied from the West, and in that sense, have no sovereignty. He's trying to obviously change the equation to say that Ukraine is not a sovereign nation. And he also believes that really wonderful quote from George Orwell that the quickest way of ending a war is to lose it. And he still believes that militarily, Ukraine can lose the war and that he can win it. That is his motivation to keep going to achieve his political objectives, which at the grand strategic level still are to reclaim lost territory and spheres of influence. That is why he posits the end state in terms of negotiations as looking at the position of NATO, particularly from 1991 onwards.
But looking at the situation on the ground now, even if the Russians did decide they are just going to carry on with the war, there's no sign of them having a massive breakthrough and pushing to Kiev or toppling the Zelensky administration, is there?
No, none whatsoever. So that comes back to the theory of victory, is that the West, and America in particular, loses interest and tries to coerce the Ukrainians into some sort of settlement, a surrender peace. That again is also an interesting quote from John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, who sort of says there's no way that Ukraine are going to do that, particularly again in his 25th of March remarks, and that even if they were to lose the support of the West, European NATO as well as American NATO, that they would fight with their bare hands rather than accept a Carthaginian peace. So the Ukrainians aren't going to do that. Sovereignty means a lot to them. And every time you have a major strike like at Sumy, which kills lots of civilians, the urge, motivation for the Ukrainians to keep fighting remains there. And it's total means multiplied by your strength of will, which gives you your power of resistance. The power of resistance and the will of the Ukrainians to keep going is still very strong.
And Marco Rubio also said that the US has other priorities that they need to be focusing on. Presumably, this is the Pacific theater. How big is the challenge the US faces there? And is drawing down in Europe really a logical step to achieve anything in the Pacific?
Well, I don't think you necessarily would have to say that China is the immediate priority. I think one of the other immediate priorities, of course, is Iran. That's more immediate in terms of time. And I'd say that really because of the difference in terms of what you want doing in what time frames. So if you take, for example, China in terms of Taiwan, we often talk about a thing called the Davison window, which is when China would be capable or have the capability to invade Taiwan, if that is something that the US actually wants to stop. Now, of course, you technically could bring that Davison window forward from a Chinese perspective if you believe that you could win quickly if the Americans weren't going to come to your aid. The problem with that is that you don't actually know if that's true or not at the moment because of the deteriorating political posture between the two countries because of the tariff war. But the real short-term problem for the Americans is that Trump again has put a very short deadline on the talks with Iran, 2 months to conclude by the end of May. And he's been quite hard over on the fact that something must give by that time, or we get to this rhetoric of Trump that something bad will happen to Iran, and he's talking about military operations. Now, one thing you don't want as a strategic leader, and he is commander in chief, is of course to fight two wars at the same time. So, having a significant campaign, even though it would be probably of shortish duration, or they would wish it to be shortish duration in Iran. Generally, we talk about 28 days of bombing if you want to achieve those objectives. But you never know because war has a horrible way of not conforming to what you want it to do, as the Russians have seen in Ukraine. So there's a lot of balls in the air for the Americans. China is one of them, but I don't think it's their immediate problem. That is more Iran, particularly if they've not dislocated themselves from Ukraine, but we know that Europe are stepping up. They can't replicate everything in, again, a short time scale that the Americans can give, but 18 million pounds worth of aid pledged at Ramstein last week from the European partners means that Ukraine will definitely still be in the fight for 2025. And secondly, the thing after the air defense priority at Ramstein was this sustainable aid for 2025 as the Zelensky's second priority, and that seems to be there from the European perspective, particularly in terms of, for example, the Czechs leading the artillery coalition. A lot of artillery coming into play from the Ukrainian side. And again, one thing we saw yesterday, which was sort of significant again in tactical terms, was the defeat of a Russian big attack from the perspective of what's happening at the moment in the Zaporizhia Oblast, when the Ukrainians, using their own indigenous drones and artillery, absolutely destroyed what we would have two or 3 years ago called a battalion tactical group, but these days was 40 armored fighting vehicles, 3 tanks, 10 buggies, absolutely destroyed by the Ukrainians, didn't get anywhere near the front line, which shows you something again about the sort of way that the Ukrainians at the tactical level are fighting, in terms of detect the targets as far out as you can, 5 to 8 kilometers, fix those targets, keep the aerial surveillance by the drones, and then strike and destroy using sort of drones and artillery. And that is why the Russians are getting nowhere near the front lines. Pokrost has now been reinforced. And again, I think it was significant that in his testimony in the Senate Armed Services Committee early in April, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Cavoli, who also, of course, is the European Command Commander of the United States forces, absolutely said that Russia are really going nowhere at the moment. There are no meaningful advances while they're taking near record losses, in that he didn't see Russia prevailing at the moment, and neither did he see the potential for Ukraine capturing every square kilometer of territory in the near future. That is why at some stage you've got to raise the ante on Russia in terms of bringing them to a meaningful negotiation. But you will not do that unless you can absolutely, probably not necessarily destroy their army at the front line, but do this sort of deep battle and try and destroy their economy. That is one of the reasons that you can collapse things. Now, again, I don't want to be too linear about that, because I remember many years ago seeing the same sort of intelligence when I was doing this stuff for real about the collapse of Syria in 2011, 2012, where all the indicators, economic, political, military, were red. They survived for another 12 years. And it's always in the back of my mind that the good old guy who fell out of the aircraft said that Russia needs to live like North Korea for a few years, and it might be that there's the potential for that because you've got a benign population. So again, you get into this mix when there is going to be no decisive military victory, and then we look at either the collapse of a country, either economically or because the military fade away, or because your political elites fade away. I don't think any of those three are in the red territory from a Russian perspective at the moment.
And it is notable though that attack in Zaporizhia yesterday was a mechanized one. That's kind of a change from a lot of Russia's more on foot infantry tactics, isn't it? I mean, should we be worried if Russia are willing to mount a new offensive, as Kiev has warned, and they're going to try and go back to these mechanized tactics, or is Ukraine still more than capable of stopping those attacks if they continue?
Well, again, General Cavoli sort of at his testimony to the SASC talked about the burn rate of the Russian armored forces and armored fighting vehicles, and it was particularly notable that in terms of the tanks that they'd lost. I think he may have been misquoted. He either said 3,000 or 4,000 tanks. It may have been. I think he said 4,000, but it was then later corrected in the record. But the point he was really making is that is the entire inventory which the the Americans possess in terms of tanks. And I think he said they lost 13,000 armored fighting vehicles. There is probably no way that in terms of Russian orthodox military doctrine, and when we used to talk many years ago about operational maneuver groups, that they could mount anything of any significant level to have a breakthrough of operational significance. They will still be doing really sort of bite and hold operations, I think, to try and take ground incrementally. But I don't think we'll see any breakthrough. And I think the Ukrainian generalship has been sufficiently good to prevent that sort of breakthrough. But as I said earlier on, it would be one of these sort of decision points that you would look for from the Americans. What would they do if they saw this sort of offensive from intelligence means and then potentially unfolding? And would that be a decision point for them saying all bets are off? Because at one stage, of course, I did talk at previous interviews about General Kellogg saying, come to the table or else, from a Ukrainian perspective, that they wouldn't get the support, or from a Russian perspective, that that America would give Ukraine every inch of support. So we just don't know where that still stands at the moment for the future, because the strategy of the Americans is pretty opaque because of the muscular transactionalism, as you might call it, of Trump. And even today's announcement about the mineral deal is really just only a memorandum of intent at the moment. It is not a fully pledged agreement, in the same way that Trump's intent is to end the war, but we still don't know the how, where, how, when, who that might come to fruition.
And as you say, the US's intentions in terms of support for Ukraine are quite opaque at the moment. Europe's much less so. What have you made of Europe's support for Ukraine in recent months? And is there more they could supply right now to assist Ukraine?
Well, I think they're supplying what they can at the moment. There's certainly, from a German perspective, I would say that if you look at the industrial base and the ramp up of Rheinmetall, the German arms manufacturer, that is really ramping up significantly for the future. I do think there will be a fairly major transition when we have the new government of Merz as the chancellor in Germany, particularly with his intent to supply Taurus missiles, which he said he will do if that is authorized by European allies. What he's really talking about there is the French and the British. We, of course, and the French have provided Storm Shadow and Scalp already. Not quite a similar weapon, but in terms of being a cruise missile, similar ilk. I don't think that would be a problem of that, and that would certainly help the Ukrainians in the deep battle, I think.
And how exactly is the Taurus missile more advantageous for Ukraine than, say, Storm Shadow or other US equivalents?
Well, like all these things, it's complex in terms of the different types of warheads and the telemetry and how they actually operate. So, for example, the one of the key prizes, you might say, is the Kerch Bridge. Now, everyone says that, why don't you fire some ATACMs at it and that can, will take it out. The reality, as far as I'm aware, is that the warheads of the ATACMs would not be of the sufficient power and the way they operate to be able to do that. Whereas the configuration of the Taurus missile might be able to do that, the way it's configured for sort of deep bunker busting type stuff in terms of the steel infrastructures and supports of bridges, for example. So there are nuances in how weapons are manufactured for different tasks, which is why there are many different warheads on ATACMs. So it's not quite as simple as people just saying, why don't you fire munition X, Y, and Z, or weapon system X, Y, and Z. There's far more behind it. And that's why, for example, what we've seen potentially in what happened at Sumy and the targeting of the Russians in recent weeks is that one of the things that you do after any strike when you're doing a battlefield damage assessment is you do a thing called the measurement of effectiveness assessment, where after those things occur, when your weapons have hit or not, you then tweak either the guidance or how the satellites work to give it credence to its final targets. Those things should be going on on a sort of daily, weekly basis in terms of how this works.
A Russian spokesperson has said the use of Taurus missiles would count as direct German involvement in the conflict. I mean, should we pay any heed to that sort of warning? It is something we've heard before from Russia.
No, I don't think we should. One of the parts of the Russian playbook is to threaten. They've always done that. They said the same thing on Storm Shadow and Scalp. It's a way to try and have deterrence from the West. The one thing which has held the West back all the time is their timidity. What we don't want to do is make appeasement great again. That is what Russia seeks to achieve, both in the political mind, the minds of the politicians, so that Ukraine can't take military action and effective military action.
And I wanted to talk briefly now about China and their possible involvement in this conflict. We've now learnt that there are Chinese volunteers fighting in the Russian military. China has denied claims this morning that it's been supplying munitions directly to Russia. Um, are some of these revelations and claims anything new? Should we be worried about a building alliance with Russia and China militarily? Or is this just a recognition of things that have been going on behind the scenes for some time now?
Well, I think it is a recognition. So again, you go back to Cavoli's evidence. So the first thing he said is that in terms of the North Korean involvement, that 13,000 containers had arrived in the last year in to support Russia, and that included obviously millions of rounds of artillery munitions, missile systems, and other weapon systems. So we know that there's significant North Korean involvement. I would take not the fact that there were Chinese personnel in Russia with a pinch of salt, but of course Russia has always had a cadre of volunteers from other countries, in the way that Ukraine has the Ukrainian Legion, where you can sign up to fight in the Ukrainian Legion, which is part of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Therefore, in legal international law terms, you are not a mercenary because it is part of the structure. As long as those Chinese nationals are part of that, in the same way that we've seen Africans and other nationalities as part of the Russian structure, then of course it's not propaganda, but it's not against international law. What is clear is that 80% of the imports into Russia are dual use in terms of technology, civil, military, and that therefore does help to sustain the Russian war machine. Now, of course, when Putin and Xi signed their original agreement, it was without end sort of thing was the phrase I think they used, or something like that. And of course, one of the variables in war is that those people who were ideologically aligned to you can give you more support, in the way that, of course, the West has supported Ukraine for good reasons to do with international law, sovereignty issues, and things like that. So we don't know if we've reached the zenith of support to Russia from North Korea, from China, or even Iran, because Iran has also, from Cavoli's evidence, supplied at least 400 ballistic missiles to Russia, along with, of course, the major drone fleet, which we almost see on a daily basis, with the Shahed 136s being used in Ukraine. So it's one of those variables which make a linear predictions of how this war will end very, very difficult.
And just finally, Chip, does that Russian reliance on weapons from Iran, from North Korea, and equipment, at least from China, what does that say about the Russian military industry? And is there a long-term military industrial strategy there the Russians can keep relying on for this war?
It's a great question. I mean, most analysts would say that by the end of 2025, we reach the peak of what Russia could ever achieve militarily, in the sense that under the old Soviet system, they never threw anything away. And so there were huge vehicle parks, tank parks, armored fighting vehicle parks, where you could either cannibalize or refurbish old weapon systems, old equipment stocks, and utilize them into the front line. Now, all the satellite imagery we're seeing is sort of showing that those are being denuded at a rate which means that all the Soviet era systems have reached their nadir. We talked about the zenith of other systems earlier on, but will reach their nadir, the other end of the spectrum. They will not be able to ramp up production of their own industrial base in any shape or form to have meaningful, large-scale offensive operations, which is why we see more sort of Mad Max type things. Again, one of the things yesterday I think we saw at the tactical level was something like 150 motorcycles being used in an attack. I mean, that is not really an act of war. It might get you from A to B, but it doesn't logistically sustain you. It doesn't allow you to carry any heavy weapons. It's just Mad Max tactics.
Well, Chip Chapman, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, Louis.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.